Please, don't hit me. The cry echoed through the dark harbor, a sliver of fear against the industrial noise. Flickering yellow lights cast long, eerie shadows that danced between stacks of steel. Isabella Vance, the CEO of a global logistics corporation, was cornered against a cold metal shipping container. A large man's arm, thick with muscle, was raised above her. Waves crashed loudly against the pier, a relentless rhythm. Wind whistled through the skeletal arms of the steel cranes, a lonely, mournful sound. And not a single soul dared to intervene. A calm, low voice spoke from the shadows behind them. Try touching her and see what happens. The entire group of menacing managers spun around to see just one man. He was dressed in a worn, faded jacket and scuffed boots, his frame lean but solid. His hands were weathered by the elements, but his eyes were sharp as knives, holding a weary intensity they couldn't place. They had no idea that this man's appearance, a ghost haunting the edges of the port, would trigger a shocking secret, one that could change the fate of an entire corporation and her life forever. Leo was 42 years old, a man with no address and a past he kept locked away. He was a former army ranger who now lived in the liminal spaces of the city, taking shelter where he could and finding peace in the harbor's constant motion. His only possession of value was a small rucksack containing a worn blanket, a half-empty water bottle, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird he'd been working on for months. He said it was a reminder that even when you're chained to the ground, something inside you can still remember how to fly. Leo lived simply, quietly, a man who had seen the worst of the world and had decided to become invisible within it. Isabella Vance was 32 years old, CEO of Vance Global Shipping, a titan of industry. Born into unimaginable wealth, she was viewed by many, including her own board, as a puppet of her powerful family dynasty. When she heard whispers of fraud and smuggling operations within the harbor management, Isabella decided to investigate personally, ignoring the thinly veiled warnings from her own uncle, the chairman of the board. That night, Isabella was ambushed by a group of managers. Cornered in the labyrinth of shipping containers, one man held out a sheaf of documents, raising his hand threateningly, trying to force her to sign away cargo rights that would legitimize their illegal operations. She trembled, her voice a fragile whisper. Please, don't hit me. Leo had been settling into a sheltered alcove between two containers for the night when he witnessed the scene. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into the light and spoke with the firm authority of a man long accustomed to command. Put your hands down. If you want to touch her, you'll have to go through me first. The tension was thick enough to taste. The management group, initially dismissive of the homeless man, faltered. They saw not a vagrant, but something else in his stance, in the unwavering focus of his military gaze. They backed away, muttering threats, not daring to make a move. Isabella was stunned, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe that a homeless stranger, a man with nothing to gain, would dare to shield her. After the situation was diffused and the men had retreated into the darkness, Isabella managed to thank him, her voice still shaking. Leo simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Everyone has the right to be safe. Walking back toward the harbor entrance that night, his thin jacket pulled tight against the wind, Leo's mind drifted to the raw fear he'd seen in the woman's eyes. It was the same helpless terror he'd seen in the faces of civilians caught in conflicts halfway across the world, the look of someone being crushed by forces beyond their control. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the smooth, unfinished wooden bird. He had once fought for ideals that had crumbled into dust. Now, all he had left was a simple code: you stand up for those who can't. Meanwhile, across the city, Isabella sat in her sterile, glass-walled office overlooking the harbor. She'd navigated countless hostile board meetings, aggressive negotiations, and corporate power plays. But last night had been different. She'd been genuinely afraid, not of losing money or position, but of physical harm. And in that moment of pure terror, a complete stranger had appeared like a guardian. No one had ever protected her like that. Her family saw her as an asset to be managed. Her colleagues saw her as competition to be eliminated. Her so-called friends saw her as a networking opportunity. But this man, who had nothing, had asked for nothing in return. He had simply seen someone in danger and acted. Isabella found herself staring out at the distant lights of the harbor, wondering about the man who'd saved her. What kind of person risks their own safety for a stranger? What kind of life produces that level of courage and integrity? For the first time in years, Isabella felt a profound curiosity about someone for reasons that had nothing to do with business or strategy. She wanted to understand what made a person willing to stand between danger and someone they'd never met. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. She would return to the harbor, not as a CEO conducting an investigation, but as a woman seeking to thank the man who had shown her a kindness she hadn't known existed. The next day, she found Leo sitting on a rusted bollard, carefully shaving a sliver of wood from the bird with a small knife. She awkwardly tried to thank him again, offering him money, which he quietly refused. He was humble, almost detached. Just did what anyone should do. Isabella was surprised, unaccustomed to speaking with someone who didn't care about her status or position. A few days later, she returned, this time with 2 hot coffees and a bag of fresh pastries. She sat at a careful distance and they talked, not about her business or his situation, but about the sea, the ships, the way the light changed at dawn. In the warehouse district, Isabella eventually confided her troubles. The family board, led by her uncle, was forcing her to sign contracts that would cover up their smuggling operations, threatening to strip her of her position and publicly ruin her if she refused. Leo listened quietly, his focus on the horizon. Then he shared a sliver of his own story, about a mission gone wrong, a betrayal from command that cost him his men and his faith in the system. It was that loss that made him despise deception and the powerful people who moved pieces on a board without a thought for the lives they were destroying. The two sat in silence on a stack of old pallets, looking out at the sea. An unspoken understanding, a connection forged in shared disillusionment, grew between them. One evening, as a cold front rolled in, Isabella found Leo huddled in his alcove, the wind whipping mercilessly around him. She brought him a thick, new blanket. He looked at it, then at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his sharp eyes. He told her about his wife, lost years ago to an illness they couldn't afford to fight. He'd lost his home, his job, and finally, his hope. All he had left were the memories. Isabella fell silent, remembering her own mother, a kind woman whose reputation had been systematically destroyed by the family after a scandal threatened their public image. She broke down, the tears she'd held back for years finally falling. Leo didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just took his own worn, faded army jacket from his rucksack and placed it gently around her shoulders. It smelled of salt and hardship, but it was the warmest, safest thing she had ever felt. In the following days, their strange friendship deepened. Isabella found herself looking forward to their conversations more than any business meeting. She started bringing him hot meals, learning about the quiet rhythms of his life on the docks. One evening, as they watched the tide come in, Leo gave her the small wooden bird. It was finally finished, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. "For hope," he said gruffly. "So you remember you can always fly away from the cage." The simple gesture hit Isabella like a revelation. She'd spent her life trying to control outcomes with power and money. But this man, with nothing to his name, understood something she'd missed. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is hold on to a small piece of hope. He was a soldier, Leo said quietly one night, speaking of his best friend who had died on that final mission. He used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. That night, Isabella sat in her luxury penthouse, surrounded by expensive art and designer furniture, feeling more isolated than ever. The simple, profound integrity of the man living in the shadows of her own shipping containers had made her own world feel like a beautiful, gilded prison. She looked at the small wooden bird in her hand. It was time to do the right thing. A week later, her family board discovered her frequent visits to the harbor and her association with a homeless man. They flew into a rage, giving her an ultimatum: sign the documents and sever all contact, or they would remove her and destroy her. That night, determined to get the final piece of evidence she needed, Isabella went to the harbor to verify a suspicious cargo shipment. She was ambushed by hired thugs, the same men as before, but this time they weren't just making threats. One held a knife to her throat, forcing the documents into her hand. She trembled, backing against a container, crying out, "Please, don't hit me." For the second time, those words cut through the night air. Leo heard the commotion and materialized from the darkness like a wraith. He took down one attacker with a single, brutally efficient move, pulling Isabella away from the blade. A violent fight ensued. Leo took several hits, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, but he never stopped shielding her, moving with a disciplined grace that spoke of years of training. One of the thugs, panicking, lit a lighter and tossed it into an open container full of flammable, untaxed contraband, hoping to destroy all the evidence. Flames erupted with a violent roar. Leo grabbed Isabella and dove away from the inferno as smoke and heat billowed into the sky. As police sirens wailed in the distance, she clung to him, whispering, "You just saved my life." The investigation revealed a shocking truth. The documents the police recovered from the scene, along with Isabella's testimony, proved that members of her own family board, led by her uncle, had hired the thugs to eliminate her and seize absolute power. Sitting in the hospital while doctors stitched the cut on Leo's forehead, Isabella stared at the evidence folder. Her own family had tried to have her murdered. "How do you move forward from something like this?" she asked, her voice hollow. Leo looked at her, his gaze steady. "You start small. You trust one person who's proven they'll protect you instead of use you. Then you build from there. You can't let their betrayal steal your ability to be trusted." 3 days later, Isabella held a press conference that sent shockwaves through the business world. She revealed the smuggling operation, the deep-seated corruption in her family's company, and the attempt on her life. The media dubbed it the Harbor Gate scandal. Her family's response was swift and vicious. They froze her assets, revoked her corporate access, and launched a public campaign claiming she was mentally unstable and vindictive. Overnight, she lost everything. That evening, she found Leo on their pier. "I have nothing left," she said, the reality of her situation sinking in. "You're wrong," he replied, not missing a beat. "You have your integrity. You have your freedom. Most people with money never get either of those things." "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now," he said, "you figure out who you are when you're not trying to be who they wanted you to be." Isabella looked out at the dark water, then at the man beside her. A man who had nothing, but who was more whole than anyone she had ever known. "I think I want to be someone who builds hope instead of just hoarding it." Starting over wasn't easy. Isabella had to learn skills she'd never needed, managing a tight budget, finding a small apartment she could barely afford, taking on consulting work for small businesses to make ends meet. She used what little she had left to start a non-profit, the Safe Harbor Initiative, dedicated to helping homeless veterans and other vulnerable people get job training in logistics and maritime trades. Leo, initially hesitant to step out of the shadows, became her first partner. His quiet strength and understanding of life on the streets gave their work an authenticity that no corporate charity could ever match. The harbor workers, who had once viewed her with suspicion, gradually came to respect her. They saw their former CEO in jeans and a work shirt, helping to unload supplies for her charity, actually listening to their concerns. One evening, 6 months later, she and Leo sat on the pier, watching the sunset. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The power, the luxury?" Isabella thought for a moment. "I miss financial security sometimes. But I don't miss the emptiness. I don't miss wondering if anyone would care about me if I wasn't wealthy." She looked at him, her heart full. "Now I know. You saw me when I was just a stranger being threatened against a container. You cared before you knew a single thing about my life." "That stranger was pretty remarkable," he said, "a rare, small smile touching his lips. She just needed a chance to be free. A year later, their life was small but real. They ran the initiative from a tiny office near the docks. They had planted a small community garden nearby, and sunflowers were beginning to lift their faces to the ocean breeze. That evening, Isabella came home to their modest apartment to find Leo at the small kitchen table, carving a new bird. This one was for a young veteran they had just helped secure housing. "I never thought I'd have a home again," Leo said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Isabella came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and resting her chin on his head. She looked around the small, bright kitchen, at the life they had built from the ashes of their old ones. "We're both home now," she whispered. She had traded billions for a life of purpose, a designer wardrobe for a worn army jacket that felt like the safest place on earth, and a life of luxury for a life of love. It was the best deal she had ever made. She looked out the window at the harbor lights reflecting on the dark water. The world was still full of shadows, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She had found her safe harbor.